Hello, Ajit.
Hello.
Namaste.
Namaste. This interview is with one of the founding members of the legendary band Hawkwind.
Nik Turner.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Nik Turner.
Yeah.
That's me. Okay.
Nik, before I start asking you questions, I want to confess one thing, that my knowledge of Hawkwind is very much limited.
Okay.
Because it's been only 3 or 4 months since I've started listening to Hawkwind's albums. They sound interesting, definitely. So if I get some of the historical details wrong, just don't hesitate to correct me.
Okay.
All right. Well, firstly, I'd like to ask you, how was Hawkwind formed? What was the music scene then?
Well, I met some of the guys when I was working in Holland on a rock and roll circus where I was sort of working as a roustabout, and I met some of the guys that later became Hawkwind in Holland. They were playing in a band that was working in the circus where I worked, which is like a music circus really. It was like a lot of bands came and played, and we had this big circus marquee which we put up every day in a different town, and we had bands coming in from Amsterdam to play in it, and I met some of the guys, Dave Brock and Mick Slattery, who were playing in a band there called The Famous Cure, I think, in Holland, and then I kept in contact with them when they went back to London, and when I came back to England after I'd been living in Holland for about a year, and kept in touch with them, and then eventually they were getting a band together in London and invited me to come along as a road manager, which I did, and then I had my saxophone with me, and I told them I had my sax with me. I'd just come back from Berlin where I'd been playing with all these free jazz musicians, and felt that I could play free jazz in a rock band, and that's basically what I did really. I just was in the rehearsal and had a lot of fun playing with them, and was invited to join the band, but this was before it was called Hawkwind. Well, we didn't even actually have a name then, so I was in the band before it was Hawkwind really. And then we sort of we rehearsed for a couple of times, and then we heard about a gig that was going on where somebody was organising a sort of little concert of several bands in a church hall in Notting Hill Gate, All Saints Hall, and we went along there just on the off chance of having a play, because we thought it was some way to play. It sounded good, and we went there and asked if we could play, and we were given a 10-minute spot, and people were blown away by what we did. We thought it was fun, but nothing great or particularly different, but it was actually. I mean, because we weren't trying to be different, but we actually were very different from anything else that was going around at that time. Dick Mick had joined the band as well at that point, and he joined I joined as a road manager, he joined as a road manager, I played the saxophone, he got involved with playing these sort of wibbly wobbly noises, and we got this audio generator which somebody from the arts lab I think had built. There's the kit form of an audio generator, which is like a signal generator used for testing radio valves and stuff like that. It sort of generates a square wave, a sine wave, a sawtooth wave, but when you put it through an echo unit and then put it through an amplifier, it makes this sort of wonderful whooshing noise and sort of all these really spacey sort of sounds which became characteristic of Hawkwind, and which nobody else was seemingly actually doing at that time. It was very simple, very basic stuff, not sophisticated in any way, and just very atmospheric, and it was just done in a very convincing way as well. It was actually wow. People made people sit up. People hadn't been doing music or sort of making sound effects like that really. I'd listened to Stockhausen and John Cage and all these sort of expressionist sort of musicians, composers, concrete music people, and none of them were really doing what we were doing, so it was quite unique really, and I think it's had such a characteristic sound, made a great impression upon people, and you know, I used to listen to the Pink Floyd, and I liked what they did, and I liked the sort of sentiments and the ideas of what they were doing. And I think that was when Syd Barrett was in the band, and I think things changed rather radically after he left. And also, I think probably drugs were sort of influential to some degree in the music scene at that time. Lots of people were taking psychedelic drugs, and although I believe the Pink Floyd didn't, I think Syd Barrett was the only person in the band who actually did, and he actually damaged himself really, probably with overindulgence in that sort of thing. But you know, that's what happened to some people at that time, and people had to be, I think people weren't sort of responsible enough really to sort of know their own limitations and be responsible in terms of looking after and caring for themselves or their friends who were sort of, you know, perhaps not having such a good time on drugs. And I think that's what happened to quite a large extent to people. But it didn't really happen to anybody in Hawkwind as far as I recall at that time. And even Robert Calvert, who was a sort of poet in the band, who I'd known for years previously, he wasn't sort of, his problem wasn't drugs really. You know, I don't think anybody had a drug problem really in the band. People were experimenting a bit, and you know, psychedelics were sort of really what the music was very very apt and sort of very suitable for that sort of thing really. You know, it's so atmospheric, it's sort of music took you away, you know, and if people took drugs as well, that sort of enhanced the effect. Yeah.
And Hawkwind, they are widely acknowledged as the pioneers of space rock. What, according to you, is space rock?
Well, I think that space rock is music which has a very spacey atmosphere, which is what you get from the audio generator and the electronic effects, but also has information like lyrics which are about space and which are relevant to space, and which, I mean, you could talk about inner space and outer space, and I think both of these things were what Hawkwind was into at the time. We had Robert Calvert, who was like a very imaginative, I'd say, science fiction writer really. He probably would call himself a poet. And I think he considered himself to be a space poet because he wrote about spacey things, you know, and he had the idea of the space ritual, which was a thing that Hawkwind performed, which was like a lot of his songs and some of my songs as well, which were had very sort of science fictional and science fantasy oriented lyrics. And to me, space rock is rock music that takes you somewhere else other than singing about, you know, kitchen sink reality and problems, you know, that people are experiencing in society. It was much more ethereal and talking about outer space and sort of much more sort of science fictional about space travel, time travel, many things surrounding and to do and influenced by science fiction writers and science fantasy writers also. Michael Moorcock became involved with the band because he saw the band as something which characters out of his books could relate to. So Jerry Cornelius, who was one of his characters, used to play Hawkwind in his cassette machine in his car in the books, you know. And also Hawkwind was very influenced by Michael Moorcock's writings about science fantasy, you know, heroic visions of mystical characters and magic swords, but a lot of it actually based upon mythology. You know, a lot of Michael Moorcock's stories are based upon world mythologies really. I would say, you know, you could say Teutonic mythology, but also Celtic mythology and Nordic mythology and Vedic mythology probably, and all sorts of mythologies, Egyptian, Sumerian, Atlantean, Aryan, you know, lots of different ancient mythologies. I mean, Mayan, I went to Mexico recently and studied a lot of Mayan mythology and Mayan history and I find it quite fascinating, really. I mean, that's what sort of drives me a lot of the time. Those sort of mythologies that are very interesting and very otherworldly, but all seem to have a common root. You know, you can see them all coming from the same point and spreading out, and sort of dissemination of information and ideas and beliefs and ancient cultures all seem to have very similar sort of roots, I would say.
Do you think the bands of the late 60s and 70s, you know, especially the psychedelic, the so-called psychedelic bands and prog-rock bands, were influenced by technology? For instance, synthesizers.
Well, I think, you know, technology was made available to people, and suddenly there was this new technology which allowed you to create your own sounds. That was what was good about the technology, I think. It enabled people. So before that, all you had was electric piano or guitar or drums or bass or saxophone or trumpet. You had all the like acoustic instruments. Suddenly electronics gave people the ability to simulate those instruments and also to sort of create almost any sound imaginable. So that was what was good about it. It just suddenly, you know, created or gave people the facility to create almost unlimitedly different sounds, you know. So I think it, you know, had the natural effect of affecting the music, because of, you know, suddenly it put music into another dimension.
I've listened to the debut album Hawkwind, and in that the tape recorder device was used for modifying the sound, or for transforming, and as a transformation device. The tape recorder was used as an instrument, to modify the sound to.
Well, I think it was used more like an echo. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, I'm referring to.
Yeah, we used tape echoes and stuff like that. I mean, I wouldn't say.
How was this how was this carried out? The whole process.
Well, I think that, you know, you could get echo units like a Watkins copycat, which actually gave you the facility to sort of, you know, indefinitely have repeats and stuff like that, before you had sort of the advent of digital technology and chorus pedals and stuff like that. So I think, but you see, I think what you should realise was that Hawkwind wasn't an extremely technical band. We didn't have a lot of extremely sophisticated technology. We had just really simple things which we actually made quite a sort of you know, a sort of profound effect with, you know, done in a very simple way. You know, Pink Floyd were quite successful, had loads of money, were able probably to do almost anything really if they wanted to, although I mean, I don't know what they did. I didn't really listen to them a lot. I think they were quite profoundly influenced by the radiophonics the BBC radiophonics workshop and the people that made the music to Doctor Who. I mean, that was what really influenced a lot of people in that time, you know, because it was just like nebulous music, really. You know, previously people would play the piano, which was ding dong dong dong. Now you suddenly had this thing that went boing. You know, you had this sort of ability to sort of, you know, play endless notes that were just sort of, you know, sweeps of sound, and then suddenly these took on another dimension of their own. You know, you could put them through echo, and suddenly you could create this enormous sound that was sort of completely enveloped you. You know, that was quite interesting. Really.
So where did that inspiration come from to use the synthesizers?
Well, I don't know. I think we all listened to quite a lot of records and stuff like that, and I think probably from people like Stockhausen, really, and John Cage and Cornelius Cardew and Philip Glass and all these sort of expressionist music producers, you know. I mean, there was a thing at the Roundhouse which I saw in probably 1965 or something like that. It was called Cybernetic Serendipity, and it had a lot of these sort of expressionist players there producing music, you know, who had all these very bizarre ideas about how to produce music. You know, I think Philip Glass would get a piece of sheet music and then spray ink on it, and then play the music that was created by these, wherever these dots of ink landed. You know, it was just done very randomly, and they did a lot of that sort of thing, I think, and that was probably what was an influence in sort of generating interest in this sort of music, and generating interest so that people developed these sort of electronic sort of devices and sort of sounds, because they were seen as very atmospheric. You know, you could find, well, sound is a very powerful thing. You can actually knock buildings down with it, you know. So it's 7 cycles per second is supposed to be a very critical vibrational speed that you can, you know, do a lot of damage with. It's supposed to be, I think it's the actual same speed as the brain waves, and I think if you have strobes at that speed, it's likely to induce epilepsy. And I think that, you know, by realising the power that music had, and the power that sound had, you were able to actually create sort of atmospheres. You know, you could sort of have this sound that really knocked you out, or you could have, I mean, you know, Dave Brock says he was trying to produce music that made people throw up. Well, I wasn't. And Lemmy said he was trying to produce music that would make people's heads explode. Well, I wasn't. I personally was into producing music that made people feel good. That's really what I've always tried to do, you know. And I think that, you know, people realise the power of music and realise, I mean, I think people have always realised to some degree the power of music, but I don't think it was popularly acknowledged that music had such a power, that music creates and can stimulate various emotions, and that music can make you feel really good and high and uplifted. Well, I mean, people have known this, you know, by like sort of church music is supposed to be uplifting, although I just find the whole ethos of the church is terribly bigoted and hypocritical. But the music itself is a very uplifting experience. And I think that, you know, this is what people were getting into with the sort of electronics that they were producing, that, you know, if you make a sound that goes, you suddenly find yourself being lifted up by it. And that's what, you know, the music that had, the effect that the music had on people, and that was the effect it had on the people that were playing it. And they realised that they were doing this to themselves, but they were doing it to everybody else as well. So it's a sort of, I mean, I find this with music that I play, that, you know, the music I play affects me and it affects other people in a similar way. So if I'm feeling really good about what I do, it makes people feel good, because I'm just sort of, I can be seen to be having a great time, and people enjoy that. They suddenly realise, wow, he's having a great time, well, so am I. It becomes a very infectious thing. And so if you do things in a very, I mean, I always try to do things in a very positive way, so that people, you know, enjoy what I do. I don't try and produce stuff, music that makes people feel depressed or, you know, sad. I'd far rather make people feel really happy and elated and wonderful, you know, and I think that's what we were trying to do, what I was trying to do, and I think sort of certain aspects of what Hawkwind was trying to do was that. I wouldn't say it was totally, because as I say, you had people within the band who had completely different ideas about what the music should be doing, but fortunately, I mean, you see, I mean, the problem is as well, when people start taking drugs in a situation where music is involved, the drugs tend to sort of alter people's perception of what the music is about as well. And then it becomes a very personal thing where not only are people's perceptions altered, but they're controlled by how the people feel within themselves as well. If they felt really bad, then it's going to enhance the badness. It's not going to suddenly make them feel everything feels great, you know, because and it's a sort of knock-on effect, really, rather, you know. And I've always tried to make people feel good. I think that's really, you know, a service that I try to perform.
Do you think the natural surroundings had a major role to play in Hawkwind's music? The place where you hail from.
Where I came from?
Yeah. I mean,
well, probably. I don't know.
For
I
that matter, all the
mean,
members.
my own. I think everybody's background and their upbringing has an influence in what they do.
yeah, I mean the place where they lived, you know,
I think
perhaps
so.
the sounds
Probably,
from
yeah.
that coming from that place.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I grew up in a seaside town where there was a fairground and, you know, lots of very transient things going on, but lots of people passing through and lots of influences. And I knew loads of people when I was growing up who were into. Well, I mean, I was interested in all sorts of music in my, you know, development period. I was very interested in jazz and. Rock and roll was very interesting to me after a while. You know, I got involved in all of that and found it very stimulating. And I suppose, I mean, the thing about, well, I suppose, working in a band where there's a lot of freedom is that you find that how the band itself finishes up is a product of all the people in it. So it's a product of all the influences to which they have been subjected also, and you know, the way they have developed and what they've been, you know, involved in, really. So I suppose to analyse a band, you need to analyse the people in it as well, because they're all influential in creating what the overall effect is.
Yes.
So,
But do you think there was any demand, any cultural demand for abstract sounds, for a particular sound?
Do I think there is a demand for abstract sound?
No, I mean, was there a demand at that time? You know,
Was there? I don't think so, particularly. I don't think people were, you know, consciously looking for something different. I think when something which appeared to be different came along, they picked up on it and liked it. You know, it was actually, but it was a whole. You see, it was more of a social phenomenon, really. You know, it was a whole attitude. It wasn't just people producing pop music that they thought, oh, this sounds different. You know, people will like it. It was more like. I mean, I personally feel, you know, that what I try to produce is music from the heart, and I think that that with Hawkwind, I think that we were producing something radically different enough, but we were also involved in, like, the alternative culture, you know, and involved with people and being very open to people and using music. I mean, I always felt music is a healing thing, you know, and using music in a very positive way to benefit people. So you know, you do benefits for people. You know, they say, oh, we want to do a benefit for Amnesty International or CND or you know, or for the local children's play group, or I mean, you know, we just used to get involved in lots of different things, and I think by being involved in those things, you know, people give you things. They give you the ability. They give you the power. You know, which is a very benign thing. It's a very good thing. You know, people will invite you to do a benefit because they feel that you have the power to draw people together, but they're giving you that power. You know, you may not feel you've got it yourself, but suddenly you're in that position where you're doing this thing. And I mean, it's a sort of process of being open, being available, being accessible, and being, you know, being in accord with what people feel and sort of, you know, feeling, you know, harmonising with the vibrations, as it were, you know, and so you get involved in these things and people give you that power. You know, I've always found that people give you the power. I read a book about this, I think it was a Portuguese sailor, explorer type person in South America in the 14th century or sometime like
Vasco
that.
da Gama?
And no, it wasn't Vasco da Gama, it was another sort of guy, Portuguese guy, who got lost. And he, which people identified with prog-rock. And so, I mean, people said that Hawkwind were playing progressive rock, but progressive rock became a bit of a cliche to me. It became what bands like Yes and loads of other bands that were doing all very clever music. I played at a progressive rock festival in Mexico a couple of times, and the bands there, I found, I mean, my attitude was, can you dance to it? And you couldn't, and so consequently I found it really boring, because, you know, it didn't touch me. It was very clever, and it was music for musicians, and I guess there were a lot of musicians that appreciated it because they wanted to play that sort of thing. But to me it was really boring because I couldn't dance to it. And I like music you can dance to. You know, music is about harmonising and touching people and raising their spirits and sort of, you know, emotionally touching people, and it's emotional expression. And a lot of what I found prog rock, you know, boring, people showing off on stage how clever they were and how, you know, I just found it very boring. And so I think that the punk was probably quite an interesting reaction against all that sort of thing, whilst, you know, actually Hawkwind were as much punk as punk was, really, because of the attitudes and the non-musical seeming background that people came from. A lot of the people in the band, I mean, were sort of, you know, Robert Calvert hadn't been in a band, I hadn't been in a band, well, I had been in a couple of little bands, but nothing substantial. Dick Mick hadn't been in a band, Del Detmar hadn't been in a band. You know, the band was ostensibly made up of road managers a lot of the time. You know, all the people that came through the band that hadn't been in bands before had been roadies, but were able to actually contribute something worthwhile to the band, which was of value. And it's almost as if Hawkwind was like a Dada experience of music produced by non-musicians for non-musicians, which was like the public, and people were able to relate to it in that way. It's like the punks, you know, kids were able to relate to punk, you know, as a reaction against what had gone before, you know, whether you call it a generation gap or whatever. But punk was sort of a reaction against that young kids were able to identify with. Oh, I can do that. You know, oh, I've got a guitar, I can make a lot of noise, I can scream and shout, and it's great. We're all having a great time together, and we're all expressing ourselves, and that's what punk was, and that's really what I felt Hawkwind was to me. And I think it was, you know, what I was playing was like free jazz in a rock band, which is what punks were playing, you know, free jazz in a, it's still similar, you know, free jazz in a rock band, self-expression really. And I think that was what gave it the validity, that it was actually people expressing themselves, not very particularly technically, a bit like, you know, I don't know if you study art, you know, Picasso's cartoons and stuff like that, which look really weird and wacky, and you think, wow, people said, oh, a child could have done them. But then if you look at what Picasso did in his earlier days, he's such a fantastically fine artist that, you know, he could only achieve those seemingly simple, primitive drawings or paintings by being this fantastically fine artist, really. You know, that's what I think punk was as well. It was people getting a guitar and playing two chords and singing along to it, and being inspired by other people, and other people being inspired by them, and it create a whole movement, you know.
Well, just out of curiosity, do you think Indian music has played a major role in Hawkwind's music?
I think there are certain similarities, really. You know, you talk about the electronics, yeah, and then you talk about, or one, you know, touch upon
because I could hear the sound of the sitar. And,
yeah, the sitar. That's right. You have the drones of the sitar.
The drone sound.
Yeah.
Like the. I don't know if you've come across this instrument used in the temples, like a shank. When you actually blow it, it's like it's got a drone kind of a sound. Like, oh.
Yeah, you have that. So I mean, there are certain similarities, and I think it's sort of. I think Indian music, I mean, although it's much more sort of highly developed and perhaps a bit more controlled, but I think actually the music of Hawkwind, you know, like this electronics that you're talking about, is very similar to the drone in the sitar.
Yes.
Really, it can be seen to be, you know, and it's a sort of meditational sort of thing.
Yes,
that sort of aspect of it, you know. It's I was talking to somebody the other day about chanting. You know, they were saying, oh, you know, it's great we do this chanting. Do you want to do some now? I didn't at the time, but when you're chanting with people, just going if you get like a few people chanting, you suddenly get all these harmonics coming out of it, where you get these really high-pitched sort of noises, which I think is quite amazing. You know, it's sort of they're harmonics that are generated by the lower harmonic, the lower frequency harmonics. You may have everybody going but suddenly you'll have these ones that will go and sort of really. Have you experienced that?
I'm not personally.
Oh, it's fantastic. You know, I just thought, wow. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day about the sort of the sound properties of megalithic sites, and like ancient, you know, these caves and places of initiation, where, I mean, I've got a film of it. Somebody gave me a bit of video footage of these people producing sounds with these sound generating devices, which produce a sound, and they were trying out different frequencies in these sort of really ancient caves in France, and they said it was fantastic that with certain frequencies you'd suddenly get this sub-bass, this sort of standing wave that seemed to be coming out of the floor. Yeah. You couldn't actually. It's a sort of similar, you know, to this harmonic frequency thing that I was just talking about with people.
Yeah, a remote,
people chanting.
Depending on the dimensions of the space.
Yeah, and it was almost as if these places were designed to be able to create those sort of things. So the sort of the medicine man or whatever, the shaman, was able to take people to these places. I mean, they may have had a perfectly legitimate sort of spiritual reason, but for us now, and our primitive understanding of ancient cultures, it seems quite amazing that somebody could, by just chanting a particular note, could generate this fantastically low sub-bass frequency that just makes your hair stand on end. And what is also very interesting about it is that outside of this sort of initiation place, out in the open air, you couldn't hear this thing at all. But if you're in another chamber of similar type, some distance away, you could hear it really clearly, coming from that particular source. And I just think it's quite amazing.
It's strange. It's kind of similar to something I experienced for part of our course. It was acoustics, you know, as part of the. And I took some measurements in the local church. It's an old Norman church, you know, with the arches down the side, blah blah blah. And did a frequency sweep between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz, and set up microphones all over the place to measure the frequency response at different distances from the sound source. And it was odd. And Jim Barrett even mentioned that actually my results showed that in the voice frequency range there was no loss of power right the way through to the back of the church. It was just. So it might be a similar sort of thing, you know.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
The building was designed in such a way so it would carry a voice for preaching.
Yeah, that's right. It's acoustically designed
because they didn't have apps
to maximise. Really, it's like like these theatres in Greece, you know, Delphi or places like that. You know, have you been to those places?
No, I haven't.
Oh, they're fantastic. I'm quite amazed. You know, you stand in the middle, and people can hear you from right out the back with and you can whisper, and people can hear you with real clarity, and it's fantastic the way that they're acoustically designed like that. I mean, we're so stupid, you know, we sort of think, oh, it must have been luck, but I mean, it wasn't really at all. It was just an awareness that they had and a knowledge that they had that we can't even conceive of, really.
I agree. I remember once seeing a programme about Stonehenge suggesting that there may have been some, you know, the placement of the stones might have something to do with the acoustics.
Yeah, that's right. I think they had that on this same programme about these caves. They said that, you know, they tested out the various acoustic properties within Stonehenge, and there were certain places where the sound was almost magnified, but you couldn't hear it out. Listen to a lot of Latin music, Cuban music. I listen to music that I find demanding, really, to play, rather than listening to pop music that I think is great on one level, and it's probably very expressive and sort of very representative of the music business or the generations that are interested in sort of pop music. But I tend to listen to music that inspires me, really. So a lot of bands like The Human. I don't know what The Human League do. But yeah, I mean, I noticed in your notes that you refer to The Human League as if they are sort of a contemporary of Hawkwind or influenced by them, perhaps. I mean, they might be influenced by them. A lot of bands were very influenced by Hawkwind.
Yes.
Aside from punk, you know, the people were actually inspired by
it. They were originally, I mean, from the books that I've read, they were originally against the hippie culture. I mean, hippie culture in the sense, as in drug taking and the drugs, and they were against that kind of a.
I think it started out like that.
Yeah, but I mean, but then later on they were known as trendy hippies, the Human League. I mean. No, they were later on known as the trendy hippies. But the one thing that I've come across is that the theme was, basically futuristic, and something to do with science fiction again, just like Hawkwind. Though in a completely different way. I mean, they were inspired by science fiction writers like Philip K. Dick.
Oh, right.
And some of the songs are based on that. I mean, before they became the so-called commercial band, they were into that avant-garde music and experimental music. Well, in fact, one of the songs called "The Dignity of Labor," it was inspired by the Russian space program.
Oh, okay.
It's like a four-part instrumental piece, and I believe Hawkwind. There was a similar song by Hawkwind, "Bring Me the Head of Yuri Gagarin."
Bring Me the Head of Yuri Gagarin?
Yeah.
Well, that was actually the title of an album.
Yes.
Originally.
Yeah.
And that title was devised by actually an Indian boy named Nazar Ali Khan, who's lived over in England for a long time. I don't know if he was living in India and his parents moved here. I think his father was involved with the RAF. He was a doctor. And Nazar devised that name because of also involvement with Hawkwind and his own inspiration from it. And in particular, the guy that did all the graphics, whose name was Barney Bubbles, who was a very good friend of mine, who devised all the Hawkwind graphics. He designed all the album covers. Generally, not absolutely all of them, but most of the album covers, and he was one of these very creative people who was very happy to put his energy into the band and do lots of things that were for the sake of art, really. He did an album cover for me. I mean, he did all my album covers forever, really, until he died. Actually, he committed suicide, very unfortunately. But prior to that, he had been doing all of the early Hawkwind album covers, and then he was doing all of the artwork for Stiff Records. And that was all, you could see all the Dada influence in punk, really, because he was very knowledgeable about Dada and New Realism and all these other sort of art movements, and was sort of quite influenced by some of them, or inspired by them probably rather than influenced. And Nazar was actually inspired by Barney and worked with him quite a lot, and so the Bring Me the Head of Yuri Gagarin was probably part of another movement which was about the Inner City Unit band that I had, which Barney did the artwork for, and one of the covers was a very, very strong reference to the Soyuz space projects, the Russian space projects, and Yuri Gagarin and all the astronauts that went up, as well as a lot of heavy references to M.Sc, the Chinese leader, who was seen as sort of somebody who sort of promoted social change to a people that had nothing. I mean, I think M.Sc is a very controversial sort of person, really, because he's purported to have done a lot of terrible things. Like the Long March was about destroying, and I mean, there was a whole sort of thousands, millions of people were killed seemingly by him, or as a result of his policies, which were totally radical and inhuman, I think. I mean, I don't know that much about him, but, you know, on one level he's cited as a great hero, and everything he did was wonderful, and people in China won't hear anything against him, even now, in this age of enlightenment. But in the process of the social changes which he made, many people suffered enormously, and but I think that, you know, only the good things are seen about Mao Zedong, and only mentioned about him. Chairman Mao is seen as this great father figure who, ruling over billions of people. I mean, China, there's supposed to be 1/5 of the world's population is in China, which is like huge. And so these were the influences which Barney was involved with, and which I think NASA was actually also influenced by or inspired by. And I think that's how, as well as the space program was very important, the Russian space program. I think it was a sort of science fiction joke, really. A bit like Philip K. Dick's, you know, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which became Blade Runner.
Yeah, Blade Runner.
Ubik as well, I think. Ubik, there was a book by Philip K. Dick called Ubik. It was about the counterclock world, you know, world going back, I mean, the time going backwards.
Oh, okay. I don't know that one.
I mean, that inspired one of Human League songs, actually, called Almost Medieval.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, I don't know, as I say, I'm not sure about, I don't know the Human League repertoire, really, to know about their influence from science fictional aspects, you know. So,
and also, you know, the fully automated shows of Hawkwind, you know, as in multimedia, and I mean, they were ahead of its time.
Well, I think that, I mean, there were other, I mean, it may be also that Hawkwind were actually personifying a lot of those things, which had been going on for some time. I mean, I went to a club called UFO in 1966 or something like that, and saw the Pink Floyd playing there.
Really?
And that was a bit like, well, it was like multimedia. You know, there were sort of psychedelic lights and noisy music, and sort of quite enlightening sort of music, and uplifting, and lots of other things going on, you know. And I think that Hawkwind just brought it to the fore, really, and they attracted a lot of the people that were involved in those sort of mediums, and gave them a platform where they could be, you know, they could be as creative as they wanted to be, and get the credit for it, and for the thing to be, you know, seen, popularized, really, made more popular, and so that the people who had the creative ideas were able to benefit from it, really.
And similarly, you know, even just for your information, I mean, there's some one of the members of the Human League, I mean, was a slide projector, and he used to sit with the audience and project slides.
It's what?
He was a slide projector.
Oh, okay.
He used to sit with the audience and project these slides according to the music.
Oh, okay.
So, something like Hawkwind.
I think Hawkwind were doing things like that. It was all very experimental, really, and you see as well. I mean, we were very happy to encourage people to do that sort of thing, and to give them the opportunity to do that sort of thing. And I think that was probably something which a lot. I mean, I suppose you might term it as sort of art rock, because it gave creative artists a sort of a canvas almost to sort of do whatever they wanted to do, you know. So that was what was very good about it. It attracted a lot of very creative people who were then allowed to express themselves, or promoted or encouraged them to express themselves.
Do you think space rock influenced a lot of post-punk bands, and the post-punk bands in turn influenced you know, some of the bands like Hawkwind later on in the 80s, in the 1980s?
I think that
did they complement each other?
Yeah, I think that you can't really sort of understate the amount of influence that Hawkwind had on people, you know, on other bands and other musicians and creative people, really. And it's a shame that it went where it did, really. You know, Hawkwind became from being very free and very open and very accessible and very generous with its time, it became completely opposite, really. You know, and I think, you know, Dave Brock, the guitarist, made it his business to sack everybody from the band so that he could completely control it. And unfortunately, in my opinion, the band, you know, then became limited by his imagination, because he didn't want anybody else to get the royalties for any writing credits or anything like that, you see. It became all like a bit of a business, really, to him, and a way of making his own private income, really, to the exclusion of everybody else. And unfortunately, I think it became limited by his imagination, and he didn't really have much. His imagination stretched to what could he steal off other people, really, in terms of ideas, and to me that's what it developed into, you know. And so it just went downhill and became, well, it became a product of somebody using other people's ideas all the time, and a lot of the time very overused ideas, unfortunately.
Also, some of the instruments that we used, for instance, the VCS3 synthesizer, it was used by most of these bands, you know, Hawkwind and even some of the punk bands, like post-punk bands like the Human League. Do you think there is any connection? I mean, do you think that instrument played a role in conveying a particular mood, or?
Well, I think it was. I think it was a very nebulous thing with a lot of freedom attached to it. You know, this sort of electronics gave people complete freedom to create new sounds, as well as, you know, doing what had been done before. But it was almost creating a vocabulary, because it wasn't like a piano or another keyboard instrument where you're just playing a scale and that's what you're limited to. You could actually create your own soundscapes.
And how were the sounds made? I mean, how were they stored? How were the sounds stored? I mean, who used to say that, okay, this is the final sound, and this is the point that that would give such a kind of an expression? No.
Well, I think basically what you have to realise is that Hawkwind was a lot of very disparate people who were all very different, and the sound of the band was the product of all that. It wasn't somebody saying, oh, you do that. It was like Dick Mick, who had this. I mean, there's a sort of very interesting biography of Hawkwind, which was written by Robert Calvert, which talks about Dick Mick squeaking and popping and chirping in a corner, you know, like his audio generator, basically. The people became the personification of the instruments they played, really. So and that was quite an interesting thing, because the band was all these people coming together. It wasn't somebody having an idea and directing it like that. You know, we all listened to lots of different music. We listened to people like Steve Miller and 50-Foot Hose and I don't know, Electric Prunes and all these sort of what were current bands at that time. Question Mark and the Mysterians, sort of very bizarre sort of bands. But a lot of electronic music as well, of what was currently being produced in this country and in America and in Europe. You know, bands like Can. There's a whole krautrock thing, you know, of all those bands, Kraftwerk and I don't know, I can't even, Cluster and Nucleus, was it? Or, I can't remember, you know, there was just loads of them at the time. Amandoul as well. You know, everybody was sort of going in the same direction, really. There was a lot of electronics coming into the music of a lot of bands, and I wouldn't say they all used it in the same way, but you know, it was, and a lot of it could be seen as having been influenced by Hawkwind, because I mean, I see you sort of ask about Hawkwind and the Pink Floyd. I always saw, I mean, the Pink Floyd were all architects. They all went to college. And they didn't take psychedelic drugs. They didn't smoke pot or take LSD or anything else. And they were very straight, what you might call straight. And in a way, you know, I just read an article the other day about the Pink Floyd, and saying how straight they really were. You know, they weren't into taking drugs, they weren't into that whole drug culture, and yet their whole following was about, you know, was all very drug influenced.
It's ironic,
yeah, it's quite bizarre, I think.
Yeah.
And so then you talked about the sort of like the difference between Hawkwind and the Pink Floyd in terms of, you know, where they were coming from. I think the Pink Floyd were very clever and very good, and they were all architects and they were all very intellectual, intelligent people, whilst Hawkwind were a bunch of dropouts, a lot of them, you know, or buskers, or you know, would-be musicians who weren't musicians, and just a very disparate bunch of people who were going out doing good things. And I always saw sort of Hawkwind as the sort of the working man's Pink Floyd, as it were, you know, the belt and braces sort of Pink Floyd, not intellectual, but just with emotion and feeling, really, and expressing, you know, anger or happiness or whatever, various emotions, just in a very primitive way. You know, I always thought Terry Ollis, the drummer, was a very primitive drummer.
Yeah.
Sounded like somebody who taught himself how to play the drums. His parents had a scrap metal yard, and I can just imagine him learning to play the drums in a scrap yard, you know, bashing around on oil drums and bits of motor car and all sorts of, you know, bumpers and hubcaps and all sorts of things like that, really, you know. And I mean, that's how I see the origins of Hawkwind. Were all about very primitive things that were more aligned to sort of emotion than intellect, really.
So there were no conventional techniques as such? There weren't any conventional techniques?
No, not really, no. No, we made it up as we went along,
Second
really.
C.
Yeah, it was just like more intuitive, really, I think, you know, and it was all like, I mean, in the early days of Hawkwind, there wasn't anybody really controlling anything, you know, there wasn't people saying, oh, this is what we're going to do, this is what you should do. It was more like, you know, we all just did what we felt like doing. Maybe somebody would have a song, an idea for a song. I mean, I wrote songs, you know, I wrote quite a lot of songs. But I'd just write them and we'd just play them. I wouldn't say, oh, well, this is what I want you to do. It would be just like, well, go wild, get out of your head, have a good time. And that's the sort of, you know, ethos of it, really.
How were the sequencers or synthesizers used in live performance?
Well, just very randomly, really. You know, they weren't calculatedly. I mean, there were certain things that people. I mean, what you're talking about is a guy called Dick Mick, who wasn't a musician, who was a schizophrenic. He was a very nice guy and a very good friend of mine, and he was a very good friend of Robert Calvert's, and he lived at Robert Calvert's, who was also schizophrenic. You know, and I don't mean that in a nasty way at all. It was just a fact that Robert used to have nervous breakdowns every 18 months or something like that. His mother told me that. She was a state registered nurse, and she claimed that he had nervous breakdowns every 18 months. And then, so there was this guy Dick Mick who lived with him, and I used to live with him some of the time also. And he was the sort of what you term a non-musician who got hold of this box that went and it was great, you know, and it was just like, wow. It's like a musical joke, really, you know, and that's really, but then that sound was so strong that it sort of lifted everything. You know, it could be so big, really loud, and then go, and as it went, like, as it sort of ascended in tone, it sort of just lifted the whole atmosphere, it lifted the whole band, and that's the sort of effect it had. And it wasn't sort of any calculated thing, it was just like feeling good. And,
I would suggest that, you know, those techniques, filter sweeps basically, from a low frequency, and you can hear it in dance music now. And I would suggest that Hawkwind were a direct influence on modern dance music.
Well, I think they probably were, inadvertently, really.
Obviously.
Completely accidental, but because of all it was like a combination of a lot of different things, not least of all these very creative artists that put their energy and creativity into creating the imagery and the presentation and and all the rest of it. Suddenly it was wow. It's like a whole art group of people, mixed media, all forms of media, that was like really progressive and really exciting and sort of completely anarchic, really, because it wasn't all ordered, and it was all just people influenced by different things within it in their own way, and expressing it in their own way as well.
But not only sonically, with the use of the synthesizer and all that sort of stuff, but I think culturally as well, because the traveller scene, it was kind of based in the hippie sort of it's kind of an offshoot from it, wasn't it? And I think that's where it kind of fermented the dance music thing, the rave culture. And I think it's there's a direct link in that respect as well.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of a whole cultural thing. I mean, you can see it as the alternative culture, but it actually spread to a lot of people, and it spread all over the country, and it affected a lot of people, and it inspired a lot of people. I can imagine people hearing Hawkwind or going to a concert and thinking, wow, I'd like to go to one of these every day, and then being inspired to go and live on the road, and then get involved in the convoy and all that scene. I was on that scene as well quite a lot. I knew all those people. I'd known them before it was the convoy and before it was anything, and it was all just hippies together, and that's what we were really then, and until hippie became a bad media term as an insult, just to, became a derogatory expression.
I think that sort of scene got infiltrated as well by middle to upper middle class wannabes.
That's right. Yeah. They became crusty fashion, didn't it?
That sort of thing.
Just see that as quite bizarre.
Crusty it's an oxymoron, isn't it?
Yeah. It is a paradox, isn't it?
And which synthesizers were used?
Right, well, to start with, we started off with an Allen and Heath audio generator, which would generate a sine wave, a square wave, a sawtooth wave. That's what we started with. That's what Dick Mick had. I think somebody built it for him from the Arts Laboratory in London, which was a sort of another creative arty group in Covent Garden, where they were sort of experimenting with art, sound, video, all sorts of things. And then we had a VCS3 synthesizer made but it was a studio model. In other words, it was a stand-up one in a wooden frame case type of thing. It didn't actually fold into itself or anything else. It wasn't a suitcase model.
Was it used in the first album, Hawkwind? The VCS3, was it used in the first album?
No, I don't think it was used on the first album. No, I think we probably used the audio generator on the first album.
Okay.
That was all it was, and on the second album, in fact, I think we used a bit of the VCS3 on the second album, but a lot of it was just audio generators, and some of it was this pedal that I had, which was a Fender Wah Fuzz volume pedal, which I found that when I put my amp on distortion and put this pedal on wah-wah fuzz, and then put my saxophone to it with a radio microphone, with some sort of microphone on it, so it was directly connected to it. I found that in certain positions I could actually create this audio generator sound. So on Master of the Universe, that particular track is my pedal doing this sort of intro.
Again.
It was one of these sort of pedals that I sort of, wow, suddenly you realise, wow, it does this, makes this noise, it goes as you move your foot on it, and I thought, wow, it's fantastic, It only went up to a certain pitch.
That's great, I love that.
It went beep beep at the top.
You've used audio generators a lot, haven't you? Apart from the saxophone, you've actually used the audio generators.
Well, I have a bit, yeah. I mean, I've got a band now. It's quite funny, really, because I've got this guy in the band who's very intelligent. He runs a desktop publishing business, but he's a sort of long-term fan, and he was really into Hawkwind, and he was really a fan of Dick Mick, who used to play the audio generator. So he came to me and saying, "Oh, we must get Dick Mick playing." And I said, "Okay, great." And he said, "I've got the audio generator," and he's got all this equipment. Suddenly he's got his. He's actually got this thing called a tri-wave progenitor. I don't know if you know that one.
Not familiar.
It's an American audio generator. but it's all this multicoloured box, you know, that's got all these knobs on it. And he said, oh, I've got this audio generator for Dick Mick to play and an echo. And I say, oh, well, great, but Dick Mick won't come and play. And he said, well, you better play it then. And I said, well, no, you better play it. And he said, me, I'm not a musician. And I said, well, nor was Dick Mick. What's that got to do with anything? So he said, oh, okay. So then he's coming to my gigs in Galacticos. And he's got this thing, and he's got a little amp, and he's making all these wibbly wobbly noises. And then I suddenly turned around and he's actually got a Korg keyboard. And I said, oh, what's that for? And he said, oh, I've got this other thing. And he suddenly produces a G4 PowerBook that's got a Moog program in it. It's got an ARP program in it. It's got
VSTs.
all these programs.
Yeah. Virtual Studio technology.
Yeah, he's got all these programs in this G4 PowerBook that he's now got, you know, and it's sort of become extremely sophisticated, state of the art.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
But he still gets the most effective sounds out of the audio generator.
That's what they say.
Because it's like hands-on analog, and it's just like,
yeah,
you can go anywhere you want, really. So it's so much more controllable, really, in terms of, you know, letting it do its thing.
Some of these emulations are, well, I'm not a keyboard player or a synth player or whatever, but as far as me being a kind of amateur, you know, I think they sound pretty good.
I do as well. I think they're fantastic with effects on them. They just enhance so that they're wow, you know, really mind blowing.
Could you tell me about the different parts of the audio generator? I mean, different sections, how they worked and.
Well, all I know about them really is it is ostensibly a device for testing radio valves. I think that's what it was used for originally, and I think because you can generate different waveforms with it.
Yeah, like an oscillator.
You've got a sine wave and a square wave and a sawtooth wave, and I don't know if you maybe got any more than that.
Yeah, of course, on an electronics bench, and you'd have an oscillator, and you expect to see that waveform. If you don't, you know there's something wrong.
That's right, yeah, and that's all it basically was, really, and it was sort of seen as, oh, well, this is a device for generating sound, you know, and it was just done very randomly and haphazardly by this guy Dick Mick, who was operating it.
But how was the recording carried out? How was everything mic'd, and the audio generators, for instance? How was it mic'd? I mean, how was it recorded, basically? For recording, how was it used?
Well, just normally, really. I mean, you know, just with a microphone, you know, with a good quality microphone, and because it was being put through an amplifier, generally, I think. I don't think it was direct injected into the desk or anything else like that. I think it was just through the amplifier that he would be using on stage, because he had an amplifier, an AC30 or something like that, which was then recorded on a track.
Any considerations given to quality of sound or anything like that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think at the time it was just sort of adapted for what was needed. I mean, I don't know, they may have compressed it and limited it and all stuff like that, or in order to sort of perhaps bring the sound down into a sort of more manageable form. I don't know, actually. I don't know. I'm not really that, you know.
But did you face any technical problems, you know, while playing the audio generator, or when any of the band members like Dick Mick or Del Lecno who played the audio generator?
The first album which we made with Hawkwind, we set all the equipment up in a recording studio with separation, so that everything's on a different track, and then we all played together. We played our stage show, which is what we played on stage, and we did that about 3 times. So we actually had the whole thing 3 times, and then we just took the best bits of it. So it was basically like a live performance, but performed in a studio and in studio conditions, so that everything was mic'd up separately. And we all had like proper monitors and stuff like that.
What do you think about digital synthesizers now? I mean, of the present day. Do you think this digital synthesizers, are convincing? I mean, in a way. For instance, to play play something in the same way as the analog synthesizers?
Well, I think the thing about it's like digitizing things. Now digitizing tends to limit them really, and what you have now is synthesizers that try to recreate the analog sound, which they do, I guess, to somebody who never heard the analog sound. But digital sound and analog sound are quite well. You can sort of distinguish between them generally. I mean, I guess digitizing is becoming more complex and more as you get as its pixels or whatever they are get smaller, then it approaches analog sound really, or to the human ear anyway, because you can't detect the steps so much.
And the VCS3 synthesizer, and use and how is it applied?
Well, I think it was just applied in a very atmospheric way really, and a very literal way as well, in terms of the electronics being used to highlight things sometimes, to sort of, if something's atmospherically going up, the electronics would sort of would enhance it really.
And what do you think about software synthesis? Do you think
about what?
The software synthesis, you can actually make a model of an analog instrument or a classic digital instrument in software to emulate that particular instrument.
Well, yes, the EMS have got one, haven't they? You can actually get software for that instrument. But because it's digitized, then it sort of changes it rather, doesn't it? You're digitizing what ostensibly is an analog signal. So, like a VCS3, you can get a program for it on your computer, or the Moog. You get programs, or the ARP, or the Korg, or any of these synthesizers. Really, you can get digital programs for them. Well, I think you probably lose quite a lot with the digitization of it, and you probably, I don't know if I haven't tried any of those softwares myself, but I just wonder if you lose a lot of the ability and the randomness of it. I mean, I think a lot of the beauty of a lot of analog stuff is the randomness of it, the unpredictability of it. A lot of the time with the VCS3, the fact that you could never get the same sound twice. You sort of really have to look hard to get the sound that you've been producing, even though you had all the knobs exactly set at the right places. Sort of almost completely uncontrollable. Whilst, a digitized version of that would be, you press that button and that's the sound you get. Exactly every time. And that, in a way, I think that's what's nice about analog, is the sort of randomness of it, and the fact that you never know what to expect. And I think it gives it sort of an unpredictable quality, which is actually very exciting. Because you can't say, we'll do what we did last night. Because when you try to do what you did last night, you do something completely different. It makes it so much more interesting, really, otherwise it gets a bit boring, That's how I see it.
And one last question.
Oh, is it the last question? I don't believe you. You've got loads of them there.
No, but you answered most of the.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
Most of the questions. I mean, without even asking questions, you answered most of the.
Oh, well, that's fine. Then. I mean, I hope to have been helpful, and rather than say, what's this question?
There are many more questions, but you answered. I mean, you mentioned about all those things, so I need to ask.
Okay, that's fine.
Well, do you think synthesis and futurism, both of them go hand in hand?
I think so, yeah. I mean, synthesis is a sort of an area of technology, really, and futurism is as well. And I think, we are progressing. We are, developing things. I mean, it's like, well, I'm reading an article yesterday about BBC television, how they're now having to broaden their horizons and encompass the fact of digitization, where you can watch television on the internet, where you can watch films on your mobile phone, where everything is becoming one, really, because of technology. All of these things are becoming interrelated. You now have you know, a telephone that you can. I mean, everything is becoming multi-purpose, really, or you know, everything is becoming compressed and more versatile, I guess. You know, I mean, soon. Well, I mean, you know, technology is moving so fast, and it's trying to. People are so desperate within technology to capture various markets that they're having to sort of be very inventive, I think, really. But it's also trivializing everything, and so some things which are really meaningful are just, you know, becoming completely sidelined and, you know, irrelevant. I think, you know, there's sort of. I think the problem is that everything's driven by money, you know, not rather than the benefits to humanity, which I think things should be driven by. You know, everything is, oh well, you know, it's like, you know, some companies pulled out of the National Health Service because they can't see themselves making enough money out of it. You know, and everything's there to make money. It's not there to provide a service or to enrich people's lives or you know, for the betterment of humanity. It's all about money, material things. You know, human life is irrelevant, really. It's becoming that way.
Thank you very much, Nick. Yeah. Thank you for your time. Yeah.
Well, I hope you've got all the information you need.
Yeah,
if you need any more information, you know, I'll be happy to. You can email me, or you can come and see me again if you want, or whatever.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think